views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. It is among the most vexing problems in our city, summarized in 2 words: affordable housing. The mayor has an aggressive plan to build and preserve 200,000 units of so-called affordable housing. Of course, defining the term affordable would be a good first step, and then answering the question, affordable for who, is another top consideration. But how is the mayor's plan working out so far, and what are its prospects? Also, what role does rent stabilization play in the process? And what, if any, role can this and other development plans play in fighting homelessness? And finally, what about low-income tenants who are stuck in Bronx buildings that are managed by rogue landlords? The entire spectrum of affordable housing is on our plate for tonight. We have 2 great advocates with us, one who has founded a housing rights organization and the other an attorney who can talk about the issue and its effect on individual New Yorkers. Now, if you have questions or comments, you send an email to us at BronxTalk@BronxNet.org or post it on our Facebook page, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. So for now, the founder of the Housing Rights Initiative, it is Aaron Carr. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And a staff attorney with MFY Legal Services, it is Natalie Webb. Thank you for joining us. Aaron, let's start with you. Housing Rights Initiative, what is it? Let's get some boundaries. What do you cover? What do you work on? And then we'll pursue those other items that I was talking about.
Great. Thank you for having me, Gary. So Housing Rights Initiative is a legal mobilization effort that systematically and proactively investigates rent fraud in rent-stabilized buildings and connects tenants to legal support. Half of all apartments in New York City are rent stabilized, and rent stabilization provides tenants with affordable, manageable, and predictable rent increases in one of the most unaffordable, unpredictable, and unmanageable rental markets in the entire country. So what my organization does is we investigate properties where we suspect rent fraud is taking place. We go into those buildings, organize the tenants, and then use the power of numbers to connect them to law firms, and then eventually file lawsuits against those predatory landlords.
Many people think, and frankly, before we really had conversations, I would think that, well, if you're rent stabilized, that's what it is. The numbers are clear what they are. We know what the process is like to deal with whether there will be increases or not. But your kind of widespread allegation of widespread fraud, it would be concerning. How widespread is the fraud? It sounds to me like you think there's a lot.
Yeah, rent fraud is like finding rain in a rainstorm. The Department of Housing and Community Renewal, DHCR, uses a reactive enforcement model that places the burden on tenants to understand thousands of pages of real estate law just in order to understand if they're being overcharged and how to exercise their rights. It's an unfair burden that's placed on tenants, and because of that, when tenants are being defrauded, a lot of times fraud occurs at a vacancy when no one is looking, right before a tenant moves in. And that's when they'll spike the rents. A tenant will move in and they're paying an illegal rent and they don't even know it because they don't know the history of that apartment.
Give me, if you can, a percentage of how many of these these rent stabilized apartments you think are in this process? Is there a way of looking at that scope and just kind of measuring how widespread it is?
Yeah, so Make the Roads did a study a few years ago. Make the Roads, it's a nonprofit organization. Okay. They did a study on this, and they determined that about 45% of rent-stabilized units are being defrauded. From my experience, it depends on where you go. If you're going to an area that's heating up, it's a hot market, it's a gentrifying area, it's very rare where we go into a building and we're not experiencing that widespread fraud, because in a hot market, landlords are going to want to raise the rents as quickly as possible, and they're exploiting the fact that DHCR, the Housing Enforcement Agency, is not properly doing their jobs and enforcing the rent stabilization system.
Do you find it in individuals? Like in other words, they'll find a landlord finds an individual who, may be kind of an easier mark than another, or do you find that it's like building wide, and then you just say, well, okay, the whole building is, has got a problem?
Yeah, from my experience, it's part of a systematic business model. This stuff happens on an Excel spreadsheet.
Systematic business model?
Yep, systematic business model.
That is a very strong allegation.
Absolutely. So when you have...
And you haven't backed down?
I will not.
I tried to get you to back down and you didn't.
I need to double down. So
Really?
This is what happens. You'll have a portfolio of 50 buildings, let's say, okay? The reason why landlords use this, predatory landlords use this as a systematic business model, is because since DHCR uses a reactive enforcement model and they don't proactively look into this, it is very rare where a tenant figures out he is being overcharged and exercises his right. So, for example, if one tenant out of 200 figures out they're being overcharged and the landlord is penalized $50,000, but they're making $1 million on those rent overcharges,
It's like dropping a quarter in the street.
it's just another check they have to write.
And if a tenant realizes that, and that's what we're going to bring Ms. Webb into the conversation, if a tenant realizes that and says, you know what, I think this may not be right, where do they go? What do they do? It would seem like you are really, having a real, you're like blowing into a windstorm trying to navigate Bronx Housing Court or anything else to try and get yourself some justice.
Yeah, I mean, the best place that you can take an overcharge is the small claims or the Supreme Court. So a lot of times the best thing a tenant can do is organize their neighbors or see if their neighbors are also being overcharged and work in groups. The power of numbers is very real in this example. And you can also, this is what my organization does, is we'll try to incentivize law firms and nonprofit legal providers to take on these cases because we have so many tenants, and then hopefully we'll be able to file this in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court.
People say that, and we've had this all the time, every time we've done housing on the show. Well, and just organize and put that together. That is not so easy to do for a couple of reasons. One is people are working, especially if you're dealing with people generally in low incomes, then they're working very hard. Everybody in sight is trying to get a job or is working, so they're distracted by that. But then the second thing is, presumably, landlords then start to harass people. I mean, these are the stories that we hear all the time. So it's very easy to say, well, sure, go organize, get your group together, and then you can fight together. But and you may have language barriers. I mean, there may be 100 things, right?
Yep. The best thing that you can do, and this is what we've realized from
is watch Bronx Talk, get some advice from the experts, right? Okay, aside from that.
There's a document called a rental history, okay? And this is something that every single landlord has to register with the Department of Housing Community Renewal for each of their rent-stabilized units. So all you really need to do is get your neighbors to just get their rental histories, merge it into one pile, and find a legal service provider or a law firm and get their input. It's not long-term kind of organizing efforts. It's just get the documents, see if there's a pattern. A lot of times what we find is there's a pattern and there's a type of rent overcharge that's occurring throughout the building, and it's much easier to organize than you think.
I really want to bring Ms. Webb in, but you're doing very well, so I got to ask you one more question. How would you know, and all the people who are watching us right now are saying, hey, I'm in rent stabilized, maybe, how would I know? How would you know that maybe you ought to start listening to Aaron Carr on BronxTalk?
So if you get your rental history, and this doesn't mean 100%, it's not foolproof, but if you get your rental history and you see an increase in 1 year, a couple $100, that is a red flag. Now, it doesn't necessarily...
Because it should be stabilized.
It should be stabilized. And there's ways that they can raise the rents by a couple $100, one being something called individual apartment improvements, where they can take 1/60th of the improvements that they do, usually on a vacant apartment, and add it to the rent. But usually speaking, if you're seeing hundreds of dollars in 1 year, even if it was all the way in the past, that is a red flag that requires further investigating.
And of course, you would, I'm guessing, recommend, for example, MFY, the person
Absolutely.
sitting to your left. All right, so I'm sorry to make you wait, but he nailed down a lot of things. So, Ms. Webb, talk to me about the cases that you see and the way that he painted this. It sounds like a very difficult process to undertake and a very difficult process to help tenants really overturn these problems. Tell me what you see.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why it's really great to have organizations like Housing Rights Initiative, because there has been a huge gap between tenants who feel completely isolated, don't know what their rights are, and finding a way to have a legal remedy. So that's where organizations such as HRI come in, because then they can organize. And when you organize and you take the case to court, you have a lot more power. I can't tell you how many times I see this all across the city. Tenants don't know if they're rent stabilized, and then when they
don't even know if they're rent stabilized.
They don't even know that they're rent stabilized. They first have to get the rent history, and that's the time that tenants come to MFY, just with the rent history, because they don't even know how to read it. And this is part of the systematic problem, that it's all on the tenant. They have no idea what they're doing. So they come. The lawyers will look over their rent history.
I'm assuming you say that with affection. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Well, you say they don't know what they're doing, but
it's very complicated. I mean, if you look at a rent history, you're not sure how much your rent should go up. You don't know what an MCI is. You don't know what a IAI is. I mean.
So again, a similar question to what I asked before when I asked Aaron about, like, how do you know? So somebody could be watching us right now and say, gee whiz, how would I know if I am, maybe I am in a situation where I'm rent stabilized and I wouldn't know.
So the first step, I would say, is to look online for how to contact DHCR. There's phone numbers, there's emails, request your rent history. When you get that, speak to a legal organization, find a lawyer, and on the rent history, it will actually
say that so easily, find a lawyer.
On the rent history, it will say RS, which is rent stabilized.
RS.
Yeah, so each year it should say the year, the amount of the rent, and if there was a preferential, and if there's a change, such as the MCI, it will say why there's a change, why it was larger than the percentage that it should have gone up. But the most important thing is the RS.
I want to go back to, I guess, my original question. Are you able to turn this around for people, and how often, and what are the challenges that you face in trying to do that?
Yes, I think we definitely can turn it around.
And you see that happen.
Yes.
It's proof it can be done.
Well, I think that there has been a lot more attention put on housing now, and that's been really great. There's been a lot more resources going towards legal organizations that are doing housing work, and tenants are beginning to realize that they actually have rights. So even in a housing court, where before it was over 90% of tenants didn't even have an attorney, and it was just free range for the landlord's attorneys, now you see the pushback, and that's been a great change to see. There's also a lot more focus, I think, on the 421A tax exemption and the J51 tax exemption, and people are beginning to understand if their building falls under one of those categories, that they're also rent stabilized.
I want to go back to Aaron. What is the effect on society, on the way the Bronx looks, on individuals caught in this? Do you think that this is, well, I realize you don't think it's an isolated problem, but do you think it has had an overall effect on the kind of the tenor of the Bronx and the nature of the borough of the Bronx?
Absolutely. I think the Bronx now is in an interesting situation in the sense that everyone always says the Bronx is next, the Bronx is next. This is when the real estate's going to come in and they're going to start building and they're going to start pushing tenants out, and it's already started, and now it's going to start picking up. So now the Bronx is at a crossroads where it's very important for tenants to start becoming very aware of their apartments, of their rents, of what they should be paying, whether or not they're rent stabilized. Now is the time, because the Bronx is starting to heat up, the rental market.
It is very clear from the rules, if you followed the news, when the stabilization board votes, et cetera, that what the rules are. You have a thing on your website which talks about illegal destabilization of rent-regulated apartments. That would seem to me to be a very obvious thing, that all of a sudden a property owner says, you know what, I want to destabilize my apartments, and they just go about doing it. That happens?
Oh, all the time.
They're both shaking their heads, yes, apparently.
All the time.
Absolutely, and it's especially
So they go do it, and then the tenants don't know, and then they just proceed on their merry way.
Absolutely. 'Cause
And you could, I'm sorry to interject, and then you could have people who are, thrown out of their apartments because the rent went up, I got to go somewhere else. So you feeding the homeless population, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely, and
Startling.
it is especially egregious when a building is receiving what's called a J51 tax benefit, and that's a benefit that landlords receive for rehabilitating an apartment building, and in return they have to rent stabilize the entire building. I can't tell you how many J51 buildings that we've experienced, and we have a case right now that soon will be filed with about 18 plaintiffs, where the building is receiving a J51 benefit, meaning 100% of the units have to be rent stabilized. In this specific example, 25% are still rent stabilized. So 75% were illegally deregulated. This is a very easy thing to enforce. You need two columns, a list of buildings that are receiving the benefit and the percentage of rent stabilized units per building. The fact that the government, DHCR, TPU, have not fully enforced this is a major issue, and it needs to change very soon.
Let's talk a little bit about enforcement. You hear that something's wrong, and if we had a spate of robberies, we would know how we might want to address those problems. Here now you're making allegations of a significant amount of fraud that potentially changes the texture of the borough of the Bronx. What kind of enforcement is there? Is it come from DHCR? I remember years ago we did a number of shows about a lack of enforcement on substandard apartments and things like that. Where are we at as far as enforcement goes and catching them, aside from people like Aaron Carr and others?
There's still a long way to go with enforcement, unfortunately. One of the options that was the most common way that tenants would enforce their rights is to make an overcharge complaint with DHCR. Unfortunately, that's a very long process that people get stuck on along the way. But
you need a lawyer to navigate that?
They don't, and
They don't.
That's actually, so there's pros and cons to all different ways of enforcement. That's the most, you can do it on your own. You can download the form online, again at the DHCR website, and you just submit it. And then DHCR will contact you, they'll contact the landlord, and they'll ask for a response, and it will go back and forth for a while. But it's the most user-friendly, for lack of a better word, rather than starting a court case, which might be intimidating for a lot of people.
You find a tenant who is caught in this sort of a web, and you say, you know what, there's a real problem here. Are you able to report it? Are you able to get somebody to say, you know what, they're right, we are investigating, and now we're either going to find the landlord or do whatever, is there a process that really works, or do you find that you're, the same kind of thing, you're going back and forth to housing court forever?
Well, I think it's still developing. I think, as I was saying, with the resources being put towards housing now, and hopefully with DHCR, I'm hopeful that it might become more streamlined and more effective. Tenants are entitled to treble damages if they find an overcharge, and DHCR will eventually get a decision. It's just a very long process. But I hope that it will improve and become quicker.
There are many property owners, and some of them I know very well, frankly, people who say, you know what, we're doing the right thing. Right now, it's costing us a fortune. It costs us an increased fortune to try to manage our buildings with water rates going up and energy rates going up and all that kind of thing. You're shaking your head no, but we hear this all the time, and they're saying, I just can't make ends meet. And so if I'm caught in this situation where the building is rent stabilized, I can't keep it going. You want me to fix this, you want me to fix that, and yet I can't keep it going because the economics don't work.
Well, I think that's the classic excuse that landlords hid behind and that a lot of people felt for a very long time. But in fact, that's these programs we're talking about, these tax exemptions and tax abatements. Landlords are getting a huge amount of money of tax, a huge amount of taxes back to maintain their buildings up to the legal standard. So for them to say they can receive this tax money, but they're not going to use it on the buildings, I mean, that's outrageous.
Let's just, I mean, we could go a long time on this, but I want to move into a couple of things. And I said at the beginning that we were going to talk about the mayor's housing plan. The idea of, and this kind of moves us to a different sort of a dialogue, the idea of building 200,000 new units in the city of New York. You want to evaluate how it's going? What is your thought about the process, and where are we at, and are we going to get there, and will this ultimately be satisfactory?
I mean, it's a very contentious issue, as
Which is
we've
why
discussed.
I brought it up.
Yes.
That's what we do.
I think that actually the plan is going very well. It's not just to build 200,000 new apartments, it's also to preserve a lot of apartments. One of the ways of doing that is these tax programs, the J51 and the 421A. But from...
Doesn't, by the way, the state legislature have to deal with 421A? I mean, didn't they punt it? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah.
Didn't they punt it to the next session last year?
Right. But there's still the J51 that's in
Okay.
effect. So I think, again, it depends on who you ask, but the numbers from HPD are 29,000 have been preserved and 14,000 units have been built. And that's the most in 2015 of affordable housing of any year since HPD began. Mm-hmm. So with those numbers, it looks pretty
You
hopeful.
feel encouraged. Were
Yes.
you discouraged by the zoning plans? Did you think, because that was also highly contentious, I can't even tell you how many shows we did on it, the ZQA and the MIH?
Personally, I was not discouraged by it. I think, as you also began the show saying what is affordable, it's all subjective. I think that it's a very difficult area to be in, to try to combine rezoning, having affordable housing, what's the percentage, what's the number, how much subsidy can a building get. I think it's very difficult, but I would say, for me, I think that it's moving in the right direction.
Mr. Carr, one of the fallouts of this, if you will, of this plan is this kind of urban renewal vision of areas of the Bronx. Specifically, I'm thinking about the Jerome Avenue study, which talks about a whole corridor on Jerome Avenue. Are you concerned about that? I don't think, and this would be my own editorial comment, I don't think it's going to be possible to do this without some displacement. On the other hand, you may get a real renewal plan. Are you concerned about this sort of a process as we go forward in trying to add more housing, or do you think we're on the right track?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a massive undertaking, and I agree that you do put some people at risk of displacement, but I think there's a much larger issue at hand, and I admire what the mayor is trying to do, with his plan, but a lot of this actually falls on the state, and I'll tell perfect example. New York City has a broken, unequitable, unjust property tax system. And this is something that very few people talk about, because when you think of property taxes, you think that, okay, it doesn't affect me, I'm a renter. But rental buildings pay up to 5 times more in taxes in New York City than homeowners. That burden is then essentially incorporated into the rents of those tenants. So the tenants are indirectly paying for those taxes, which is one of the lead reasons why rents are so expensive in New York City. It is incumbent upon the state to restructure the property tax system in New York City, and that is how you create a more affordable environment.
I have to say, I'm not sure that you fully answered my question, but I have to say in my conversations with property owners, the property tax question and basically asking Albany to take a look at that is really the same thing that you have said. You're saying it trickles down to the renters, and that's what your perspective is, but certainly the property owners are complaining in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, the Furman Center did a study on this, and they found that that this burden eventually trickles down on the tenants, and I don't know why it wouldn't, right? If you're a landlord, you don't want to have the burden placed upon you, where you're paying 5 times more in taxes than homeowners, so of course it's going to go onto the tenant.
More pronounced, more of a concern, because you brought it up in answer to my question about the Jerome Avenue study, more concern for that kind of issue in this process of adding more housing and kind of really, again, I'll use the words urban renewal, explain to me why that fits into the answer to my question.
It fits into the answer to your question because I feel, it's important to talk about the mayor's affordable housing plan, but very rarely is it pointed out that the state has a lot of control in this regard, and the relationship between the city and the state really affects how affordable housing is, built and how affordable housing exists in New York City. Another example, this is right up my alley, is rent stabilization, right? That's a bigger concern. The fact that the past 2 decades, we have lost close to 300,000 rent stabilized units. I mean, these are the big picture items. The Jerome Avenue study, is obviously a major issue, but these are the issues that I'm more concerned because it affects the entire city.
I want to ask you a little bit about, before we run out of time, I want to just ask you about Housing Court. We were talking about it before the show. Obviously, the Bronx Housing Court, we have a new building, and we were promised, well, we have the new building, everything's going to work out, there's going to be enough space. What are the conditions like? We've got about a minute. What are the conditions like in Bronx Housing Court right now?
I mean, it's
effective for everybody?
Well, you're talking about the building or the law?
All of the above. Well, I'm just talking about the process of getting justice on when you have an issue of some sort.
Well, I think that the Bronx, relatively speaking, the building is actually better and things run fairly smooth there in my experience compared to some of the other boroughs. However, I think that it's always difficult when you're in a tenant. As I said before, most tenants, I mean, again, about 90%, if not more, do not have an attorney. And you're up against landlords' attorneys who pull you into the hallway, try to sell you on anything and get you to sign something with the promise that you'll be done and they're working in your interest, and they're never working in your interest.
That sounds to me like what we've had for many years, and it sounds like that doesn't depend on the building, it depends on the process. Aaron, let's give you the final word. What do you recommend that people do if they watch the show and then they say, gee whiz, I'm not sure about this, and this? What should they do?
Yeah, number one thing that every renter should do, whether or not they're rent stabilized or not, is get your rental history. And you can go on my website, www.housingrightsny.org.
There it is. It's on the screen for folks.
And you can look up on the website. I list out how you can get your rental history. It is the most important document you can get. Some people say, well, I'm not rent stabilized, so I don't need to get it.
It goes by address and unit?
Yep, you can get it for your individual unit, so you'll know the history of your unit. And even if you're market rate, or your landlord told you that you were market rate, you'll be able to determine, or with the help of attorneys or my organization, whether or not your apartment was properly deregulated.
Wow, fantastic. I'm sure you're going to run to the computer, because I'll tell you, when I get home, that's what I'm going to do. Fascinating, even just to get the information. Thank you so much, Aaron Carr from the Housing Rights Initiative. Natalie Webb, thank you so much from MFY Legal Services. Tremendous information, and folks, we ask folks to comment on it. If you do have a comment, send us an email. I'll forward it if you have a personal question or otherwise. We always like to put our viewer mail on TV. Here's viewer mail we received on Facebook about the show we did last week, actually 2 weeks ago, with Councilmember Cohn, and the dialogue about the potential removal of trees on Marshall Loop Parkway. And so Elizabeth Q wrote on Facebook, the dogwoods on the center median are an asset to the still open space. Those trees are now removing pollution from the 1,000 cars that drive on both sides of the parkway. A question we should be asking is, why can't we get more crossing accessibility, like a crosswalk and steps for us to come down and go up in the center of terrain number 7, which is one of the ones in the center of Marshall Loop Parkway. So thanks to Elizabeth Q, who made a comment on Facebook. And if you have questions or comments on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, email them to us at BronxTalk@BronxNet.org. You put them on our Facebook page like Elizabeth did, and we'll read them on the air during a future edition of our program. We ask you to like Bronx Talk on Facebook. You can check out the archives at BronxNet.org. Bronx Talk is on the lower right navigation bar. Now, next week, we begin a series of 3 political debates each week. We'll start with a race for state senate in the 33rd District between incumbent Senator Gustavo Rivera and challenger Councilmember Fernando Cabrera. That's it. Clearly, they want me to go. Good night.